Hello everyone, my name is Guillaume DECOCQ. I'm from the University of Picardie in North France, and my talk is about the historical continuity of hedgerows in rural landscape, and I will use the species-time-area relationship to show that they can act as effective corridors for forest plants. As you probably know, in many rural landscapes worldwide, land use changes, habitat fragmentation, and the intensification of management impede the climate-driven redistribution of species, increasing the risk of local extinction. And this is especially true for many forest herb species that are slow colonizers of recent woodlands as a result of both high habitat quality requirements and low dispersal capacities. Increasing woodland connectivity is expected to mitigate the negative effects of forest fragmentation on biodiversity by promoting species movement among patches. And this is the rationale behind the use of ecological corridors. But compared with woodlands, hedgerows exhibit different microclimate condition, nutrient status, and disturbance regimes, and they are also strongly impacted by proximal farming practices. So, hedgerows offer suboptimal habitat conditions for forest herbs. According to the species-area relationship, and once the negative effect of proximal farming practices has been cancelled out, forest plant species richness is predicted to increase with the size of suitable shaded habitat provided by hedgerows. In the present study, we looked at habitat size, especially hedgerow length, width, and height, and we also looked at habitat quality via adjacent land use intensity. Aside, according to the species-time relationship, the chance for a given hedgerow to be colonized by forest plant species increases with the historical continuity of the land used as hedgerow and its historical connectivity to ancient woodlands. So in this study, we looked at habitat historicity, which is the age of a hedgerow, and at historical connectivity, that is the last but not least, time may interact with space. This is the species-time-area relationship described by Peter Adler and collaborators. Here we look at a historical continuity and the amount of hedgerow habitat. And our first research question is, do time and space interact synergistically to enhance forest plant species accumulation in hedgerows? But as you may know, all forest herb species are not equal. We can distinguish between specialists and generalists. Forest specialists usually have forest woodlands as primary habitat. They require high habitat quality, but they have a low dispersal capacity, whilst forest generalists can live also in non-forest habitats, so they have a low habitat requirement and they are good dispersers and good colonizers of recent woodlands. So our second research question is, how does time interact with space, and does this interaction differ between forest specialists and forest generalists? Let's turn to the study area and methods. We worked in the northern part of France, in all the area appearing in violet here on the map, and we select 99 hedgerows which were designed along a chronosequence ranging from the first half of the 18th century to nowadays. All were located in agricultural landscapes, and we use a regressive temporal analysis using old aerial photographs and old maps and cadasters to reconstruct the history of hedgerows. As you can see on the right part, first on the top, at the extreme right, you can see hedgerows that are present nowadays in the landscape, and going back in the past using old photos, old maps, you can see when a given hedgerow appeared. And on the top, you can see a recent hedgerow, which was simply missing on all old photos and maps, while at the bottom, you can see a hedgerow which has continuously existed through times. So this is an ancient hedgerow. And we did this for all 99 hedgerows. All hedgerows were surveyed for forest plant species. We recorded all vascular plant species and a number of local proximal descriptors. We then select a subset of 29 hedgerows, which were further sampled for species occurrence every 5 meters long segments along hedgerows that were attached to a woodland or isolated among croplands. We first used generalized linear models to test the interaction between time and space and spatial connectedness on forest plant species richness. We took hedgerow age as a proxy for time, habitat size as a proxy for space, and whether the hedgerow was attached or not to a woodland as a proxy for spatial connectedness. Then we used a generalized mixed model to test whether the probability of occurrence of forest herbs along hedgerows differ between specialists and generalists. Let's turn to the results. We found a total of 111 forest herb species, among which 43 were specialists and 68 were generalists. And in the subset of 29 hedgerows, 30 species were sufficiently abundant to examine species distribution response curves, 11 specialists and 19 generalists. Here are the results of the best GLM explaining species richness in hedgerows, and as you can see here, we found a strong negative effect of the interaction between the age of a given hedgerow and its length. That means that hedgerow age and length interacted synergistically to increase forest plant species richness in the understory of hedgerows. And we also found a positive effect of the attachment of a given hedgerow to a woodland, meaning that hedgerows attached to woodlands hosted systematically more species, more forest species. This is what is reflected here on these graphs. On the x-axis, you can see the age of the hedgerow, and the y-axis, the number of plant species. On the left, this is for isolated hedgerows among croplands, and on the right for hedgerows attached to woodlands. And you can see in both cases an exponential increase of the number of forest plant species as the hedgerow age increased. So the more ancient a hedgerow, the more abundant the forest plant species. and this is especially pronounced when a given hedgerow is attached to a woodland. Here too, now on the x-axis, this is the total length of hedgerows, and you can see that as the total length increased, the number of forest plant species increased too, meaning that there is more habitat for more plant species. And this is more pronounced for the most ancient hedgerows. In the same model, you can see also a positive effects of the other proxy for habitat size and quality, hedgerow width, hedgerow height, and the richness of shrub and tree layers in the hedgerows, but a negative effect of the intensity of adjacent land use. So that means that taller or wider hedgerows with a lower intensity of adjacent land use hosted more forest plant species. Now, this is the results of our mixed models, distinguishing between specialist and generalist and this is the probability of occurrence in the hedgerow. And you can see here a strong negative effect of the interaction between the distance to the woodland and whether a hedgerow is attached or not to a forest, and also a negative effect of the interaction between the distance and whether a species is specialist or generalist. In other words, the probability of occurrence of forest specialists disproportionately decreases compared to forest generalists as the distance from woodland increases. And this species accumulation of forest specialists was almost null in isolated hedgerows. This is what you can see in this graph. So on the top, this is for hedgerows attached to a woodland. On the bottom, for isolated hedgerows. On the left, for ancient hedgerows, and on the right, for recent hedgerows. And as you can see here, the number of the probability of occurrence, the probability of occurrence of specialists slightly increases, as well as the one for generalists, for ancient hedgerows when they are attached to a woodland. This is on the top left part of this graph. And in all other cases, the probability of occurrence of specialists is almost null. If you look at generalists, the number of generalists increased mostly in ancient hedgerows, but also in recent hedgerows. But this is not the same pattern as for specialists, of course. If we focus on specific species, for example, Viola reichenbachia, on the left, you can see that the probability of occurrence slightly increased, but mostly in ancient hedgerows. And so the probability increased with the distance to the attached woodland. This is more or less the same pattern for Stellaria holostea on the right. And here are more examples with mostly forest specialists on the top and forest generalists on the bottom. So this is more or less the same pattern. And look at Guillaume urbanum on the bottom right part. You can see that the probability of occurrence is the same all along the hedgerow. So for this example of generalists, you can see that the colonization of hedgerows is more or less random. So forest specialists are much more abundant at the attachment point, whilst generalists rather randomly distributed along the hedgerow. So, what do these results tell us? First, forest home species richness in hedgerows follows a species-time-area relationship. This is a first evidence. The slope of the relation is disproportionately pronounced in ancient hedgerows attached to a woodlands. And this slope is strongly reduced in case of intensive management of adjacent lands. We found no effect of surrounding forest cover, so we didn't find any support for the habitat amount hypothesis. And we found evidence for a directional proximal colonization of hedgerows from woodlands by specialists, probably via a mass effect, while for generalists, the colonization of hedgerows seems to be random. So, ancient hedgerows attached to woodlands are effective corridors for forest specialist species. So, creating new hedgerows to connect isolated woodlands can be a suitable strategy to restore functional connectivity, but it will be effective only on the very long term. So the conservation of the most ancient hedgerows within intensively managed agricultural landscapes, especially those connected to ancient woodlands, should be a priority target for biodiversity conservation. So this was a historical ecology approach of rural landscape tell us when focusing on hedgerows. And I thank you for your attention. And if you want to go further, here are two references where you can retrieve some of these results. Thank you.